So this video, finally, after all other videos, is about the blended with an online pathway modality. Now, those of you that had questions about this modality, I sort of made you go through all of those other videos first, which just tells you that this particular modality is the most complex one and that it requires you to know all the other things we talked about and then adds this additional twist on top of that. So I hope that you feel comfortable now with what blended is, what blended with rotating cohorts is, and now you can think about adding in this extra element, which is an online pathway. Or another way to put this is with an online cohort. So blended with rotating cohorts, one of which is online. That's just a bit long for our registrar to use as a designation for a modality. So I just want to remind you, if it's been a while since you watched the last video about blended with rotating cohorts, this is a standard example of what a blended with rotating cohorts course might look like that meets on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday and has 24 students in a classroom that fits 9 people. The difference between this model, which is blended traditional, and the blended with an online pathway is simply that one of the cohorts will be online. So just as we said that you would repeat your in-person sessions 3 times over the week for all 3 cohorts, you would repeat your in-person session for the online cohort live via Zoom on Friday instead. Now, one question that we've gotten a lot and that many of you have is that what if it's the case that some of these students in this cohort that we randomly created actually want to be in person? They don't actually want to be in the online cohort. Well, fingers crossed, hopefully, you might be able to fit them in your classroom for just 2 cohorts or 1 cohort, but that's not often going to be the case. But if you can, you should move them. But what happens if you have even more students who want to be in person but can't fit in the classrooms if you've already got them full for your other in-person cohort? This creates real interesting logistical challenges. So there are 3 things I would say to this, and then we'll give you some general advice about how to pursue thinking about teaching in this blended with an online pathway. So the first thing to say is that we never guaranteed students, if they were signed up for a blended with an online pathway course, that they would get to take the in-person pathway or the in-person cohort. So you could just randomly assign students to various cohorts and say that's how it shook out. I don't know that that would be my preferred choice, but you certainly could do that if you needed to. Another thing you could do is you could move all the students who want to be in person into what you might call a big in-person group, and then create cohorts from that group. And if you can't fit in your classroom, you just rotate once every 2 weeks or once every 3 weeks so that everybody who wants to be in person gets at least some in-person time, even if it's not every week. And then finally, I think another thing you could do, this is more logistical work, so I'm not sure if you're up for it, but you could also have students sign up for each week when they want to be online and when they want to be in person. My sense is that even the students who have signed up for in-person classes may have some weeks where they prefer to have the Zoom session rather than come to class. I think we all know that, those of us that have taught. So you may be able to work it out internally with your students, although that adds extra labor for you. So my recommendation is that you think about moving them into in-person cohorts that meet less often, or just go ahead and assign them to an online cohort and say, this is how it shook out, just like it would if they signed up for a course that turned fully online as well. So here's some advice for you before we move on. So advice about how to approach the blended with an online pathway course. So the first thing to do is to survey your students for both their preferences and their needs. So I make sure to distinguish between those who would like to be online and those who would like to be in person, and those who have to be online and who have to be in person. Because if they have to be online, you have to have an online cohort for them. It may be the case that none of your students have to be online and you really essentially just have a blended traditional course. And I've heard from many of you that that's actually what's happening. You chose blended with an online pathway, but it turns out no students who needed an online pathway signed up for your course. So lucky for you, you can just go back to teaching in a traditional blended format. If more students, this is back to the question we had before, if more students desire in-person cohorts than fit in your room, you can create additional cohort and rotate it over 2 weeks or 3 weeks, etc. One important thing you should do is you should plan the same amount of live engagement with all students, regardless of whether they're in an in-person cohort or in an online cohort. And that's just a basic principle of equity, to make sure that the things that your in-person students are getting are also accessible to your students who have to be fully online. One interesting wrinkle is if you have some online students in the online pathway who have really difficult time zones. This is a real challenge, and we don't have great solutions for that. But what I would say is that you should make live engagement optional for those students and create alternative ways for them to access the material if you can. We'll hope that that doesn't happen too much because the online students picked the times of the classes that they signed up for, so we're hopeful that they know that they may be expected to be in a synchronous session at that time. But if they can't, then you could create some asynchronous alternatives for them. And then finally, I would consider incorporating at least a few whole class synchronous sessions so that your students in the various cohorts can get to know one another. Your students in person are going to get to know one another, but if there's only a few students who have an online pathway, you want to make sure that they don't feel as if they're left out and that they're fully included in the course. And the best way to do that is to have some community building in the fully online version of the course. So we didn't say a lot here. We're finishing this video now and moving on about sort of pedagogical strategies for the online pathway, in part because I think many of the things we said in the blended traditional video will apply to this cohort, to this modality as well. But certainly, again, if you have questions or ideas about what you're thinking about creatively, we in the CAT are more than happy to meet with you and have conversations about strategies and also about scheduling suggestions. So we wish you the best of luck. If you've made it through all of these videos, we really appreciate it. This is really complex work on multiple fronts, not just pedagogically, but also logistically. And we know you're working really hard for our students, and we so appreciate it. And we cannot wait to see what you design for them in this really challenging and difficult time.